The Byrdes were, by all accounts, a normal family. Their home, a sleek two-story townhouse in a well-off Chicago suburb, was a testament to Marty Byrde's success as a financial advisor. The modern furniture, the minimalist artwork, and the sparkling kitchen appliances painted a picture of prosperity, stability, and comfort. No one would have guessed that beneath the polished surface lay a hidden world of secrets. Marty Byrde was not just any financial advisor. His reputation in Chicago's financial circles was sterling, respected for his astute investments and calm demeanor. Behind his sharp suit and reserved smile, however, was a man juggling two lives. To his clients and colleagues, he was a brilliant, pragmatic professional. But to Mexico's second-largest drug cartel, Marty was their financial lifeline. Every morning, Marty kissed his wife Wendy and their two teenage children, Charlotte and Jonah, goodbye before heading into the heart of the city, where his firm had offices in a towering skyscraper. Wendy often watched him leave, her mind swirling with plans of her own. A former political consultant, she had traded her once hectic career for suburban life, raising the kids and managing their home. Life was good, at least on the surface. At work, Marty's routine was predictable: meetings, phone calls, consultations. But there were certain clients who never appeared on the firm's books, clients for whom Marty made discreet arrangements. His brilliance lay in the complexity of his system. He had perfected the art of laundering money, funneling millions of dollars of cartel cash through shell companies, offshore accounts, and carefully orchestrated investments. It was a delicate web, one that required constant vigilance. Despite the weight of his secret life, Marty was careful not to bring his work home with him. To Wendy and the kids, he was just dad, present, calm, and collected. He played board games with Jonah, discussed Charlotte's high school drama, and took Wendy out for dinner at fancy restaurants. Their life was full of the trappings of success, yet beneath it all, Marty felt the slow churn of anxiety gnawing at his gut. Wendy, perceptive as ever, had begun to notice. She knew Marty was always working, always distracted, but she didn't pry. The Byrdes had a comfortable life. Her biggest worries revolved around managing Charlotte's growing rebellious streak and keeping Jonah off his video games long enough to do his homework. But deep down, Wendy felt a shift in Marty, a growing distance she couldn't quite explain. Marty's office was his sanctuary. From his corner window, he could see all of downtown Chicago, the towering glass buildings that represented power and wealth. It was a world he understood well, one where appearances were everything. But even with his mastery of finance, the pressure from the cartel weighed heavily on him. One wrong move, one missed transaction, and everything could unravel. He had become accustomed to the late-night phone calls. Del from the cartel never wasted time with pleasantries. It was always business, cold and direct. Del would demand explanations, updates, and projections, and Marty had no choice but to provide answers. He knew the stakes. The cartel wasn't forgiving, and his life, his family's life, depended on his ability to stay ahead of the game. But that was Marty's gift, staying ahead. In a world full of sharks, he had always managed to swim faster. His connections in the financial world allowed him to move vast amounts of money with no one noticing. On paper, everything looked legitimate. In reality, He was laundering millions for some of the most dangerous people in the world. By the time Marty returned home each night, he had perfected the art of detachment. The stress of his day never showed. At dinner, he smiled, asked his kids about school, and engaged in light conversation with Wendy. They were the picture of a normal family, at least on the outside. As the sun set on their Chicago home, the Byrdes prepared for bed, unaware of how fragile their carefully constructed life had become. Marty lay next to Wendy, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing with the numbers and schemes that kept them afloat. He had built this life for them, this illusion of safety and success. But the deeper he went, the harder it was to imagine a way out. Everything seemed perfect, until, one day, it wasn't. This opening section introduces the Byrdes' life in Chicago, focusing on the contrasts between their outward appearance and Marty's hidden criminal activities. It sets up the coming tension as the weight of Marty's secret begins to threaten the family's stability. Marty always knew the numbers didn't lie. They couldn't afford to, not with the stakes so high. Every dollar had to be accounted for, every transaction precise, because when you worked for Mexico's second-largest drug cartel, mistakes weren't tolerated. Yet, as he sat at his desk, staring at the reports in front of him, the numbers were blurring together. Something wasn't adding up. It started with a phone call. It was Del, the cartel's second-in-command, his voice cold and sharp through the speakerphone. Marty had grown used to the cartel's demanding tone, but this time, there was an edge to Del's voice that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Marty," Del said, without preamble. "We have a problem." Marty's heart skipped a beat, but his voice remained steady. "What's going on?" "There's money missing. A lot of it." In an instant, Marty's calm facade faltered. He scrambled through his files, double-checking his figures, his mind racing through the hundreds of transactions he'd overseen in the past month. This couldn't be happening. He prided himself on his meticulousness, on his ability to stay ahead. But here it was, undeniable and dangerous. "How much?" Marty asked, his voice quieter now. "5 million, Del replied flatly. "0.5 million. Marty felt the blood drain from his face. He gripped the edge of his desk, fighting to keep his composure. "I can fix this," he said quickly, though he wasn't sure how. "There's got to be an explanation." Del didn't sound convinced. "You'd better hope so, Marty. The bosses aren't patient men. You know what happens when people can't account for the money." Marty swallowed hard, his mind flashing to his family, Wendy, Charlotte, Jonah. He couldn't let this spiral out of control. "Give me some time," he said. "I'll find out where the mistake was." "You've got 48 hours, Del said, and the line went dead. Marty leaned back in his chair, the weight of Del's words sinking in. He had been so careful, so thorough. How had $5 million slipped through the cracks? He racked his brain, going over every transaction, every shell company, every offshore account. But nothing jumped out. The system he had built was intricate, designed to move millions without detection. If money was missing, it meant someone had tampered with his work, or he had made a mistake. Either way, the consequences would be deadly. That night, Marty barely spoke at dinner. Wendy noticed immediately. "You okay?" she asked quietly as the kids chattered on about their day. Marty nodded, forcing a smile, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in the chaos of missing money and impending doom. After dinner, as Wendy cleaned up, Marty retreated to his home office. He needed to figure this out before the cartel did. But no matter how many spreadsheets he combed through, the numbers refused to balance. Hours passed, and still no answers. His mind raced with possibilities. Could someone within the cartel be skimming the money? Or had one of his investment channels collapsed without him realizing? Every minute that ticked by brought him closer to the 48-hour deadline Dell had given him. If he didn't find the missing funds, and fast, his entire world would come crashing down. The next morning, Marty was running on fumes. He kissed Wendy on the cheek, told the kids goodbye, and drove to his office with a growing sense of dread. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. Every step he took toward his office building felt like walking closer to a cliff's edge. When he arrived, the phone on his desk was already ringing. Marty hesitated for a moment before answering, knowing it could only be one person. "Dell," Marty greeted cautiously. "I'm coming to Chicago," Dell said, his voice icy. "We need to talk in person." Marty's stomach dropped. If Dell was coming, it meant the situation was worse than he thought. The cartel didn't waste time with face-to-face meetings unless it was serious, deadly serious. "When?" Marty asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Tonight," Dell said. "And Marty, if you don't have an answer by then, well, you know what happens." The line went dead again, leaving Marty with the suffocating silence of his office. By the time Dell arrived that evening, the Byrde household was on edge. Marty had asked Wendy to take the kids out for dinner, a rare move that had raised her suspicions. But she complied, sensing the tension in Marty's voice. As they drove away, Marty waited in the living room, pacing, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. The doorbell rang. Marty opened it to find Dell standing there, dressed in a sleek suit, his expression unreadable. Two cartel enforcers flanked him, their presence a stark reminder of what was at stake. Marty ushered them inside, his pulse racing. He had spent the entire day going over the numbers, but he still hadn't found the missing $5 million. He prayed that Dell wouldn't notice his desperation. Dell didn't waste time. He sat down at the kitchen table, motioning for Marty to join him. "So," he said, folding his hands in front of him. "Where's our money?" Marty cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet Dell's gaze. "I've been looking into it. I think someone tampered with the system. I just need a little more time." Dell cut him off with a cold smile. "We don't have time, Marty. You understand that, right?" Marty nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes, I understand. Dell leaned forward, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. $5 million, Marty. That's a lot of money. And if we don't get it back, someone's going to pay. You know what that means." Marty's mind raced, the pressure unbearable. He thought of Wendy, Charlotte, Jonah. He had to protect them, no matter what. "I'll find the money," Marty said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll make it right." Dell leaned back, studying Marty for a long moment. Then he stood up, signaling to his enforcers. "You've got 24 more hours," Dell said, his tone casual, as if they were discussing a business deal and not life or death. "After that, we come back. And next time, we won't be so friendly." As Dell and his men left, Marty stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of their threat settling over him like a dark cloud. He had 24 hours to find $5 million, or lose everything. The clock was ticking, and for the first time, Marty felt like he was out of moves. The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield as Marty drove through the dark Chicago streets, his mind racing as fast as the wipers could clear the water. His meeting with Dell had been an unmitigated disaster. He still hadn't found the missing $5 million, and now, the cartel was running out of patience. His family's lives hung in the balance, and Marty knew he was running out of options that he pulled into an empty parking garage, the sounds of the city muted by the car's heavy doors. He had arranged for a last-ditch meeting with Dell, praying he could find a way to buy himself more time. But deep down, Marty knew time was running out. As the sound of footsteps echoed through the garage, Marty felt his heart race. Dell appeared from the shadows, flanked by the same two enforcers as before, their faces expressionless. "Marty," Dell greeted, his tone sharp. "I hope for your sake you've got some good news." Marty swallowed hard, taking a deep breath. He didn't have the missing money, but he did have a plan. One that might just save his family, if Dell would agree. "I can't get you the $5 million right now," Marty began, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his insides. "But I have an alternative. A way to make much more money for you and the cartel." Dell raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "We don't need your alternatives, Marty. We need the money. Now." Marty pressed on, desperation edging his voice. "Hear me out. The Ozarks." Dell's expression remained cold, but he paused. "The Ozarks?" Marty nodded. "It's perfect. It's a goldmine for laundering money. Underdeveloped, full of small businesses and cash-heavy operations. I can set up shop there, move the cartel's money through the region, and turn this into a long-term operation. It's safer, easier to hide than Chicago. You'll get your $5 million, and more." Dell stared at Marty, considering his words. There was a long silence as the rain continued to drum against the car. Marty could feel his pulse in his ears, waiting for Dell's decision. If this didn't work, there would be no way out. Finally, Dell leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "The Ozarks. You think you can make us that kind of money out there in the middle of nowhere?" Marty nodded, though his palms were sweating. "I know I can. I've already started looking into potential businesses. You give me this chance, and I'll make you richer than you've ever been." Dell leaned back, exchanging a glance with one of his men before nodding slowly. "All right, Marty. I'll give you one chance. But understand this, if you fail, if you try to run, or if the money doesn't come through, your family won't just be in danger. They'll be dead. Do you understand me?" Marty's breath caught, but he nodded. "I understand." Dell smiled coldly, standing up. "You leave Chicago tonight. We'll be watching. Don't screw this up. As Dell disappeared into the shadows, Marty sat alone in his car, the weight of the deal crashing down on him. He had saved his family, for now. But the price was leaving everything behind. They were headed to the Ozarks, a place Marty barely knew, with no guarantee of success. The next morning, Marty broke the news to Wendy. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, her face pale as he explained the details of his deal with Delaware. The gravity of their situation hung in the air like a storm cloud. "We have to go tonight," Marty said quietly. "It's the only way." Wendy stared at him in disbelief. "The Ozarks? You're telling me we have to leave everything behind, our home, our lives, and move to the middle of nowhere because of this?" Marty nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no other option, Wendy. It's this or they'll kill us. They'll kill Charlotte and Jonah." Wendy's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing through the implications. She had known for years that Marty's dealings with the cartel were dangerous, but this was the first time it felt real, truly life or death. The thought of leaving Chicago, of abandoning their entire life, was overwhelming. But the alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. "What do we tell the kids?" Wendy asked, her voice shaking. Marty sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We tell them we're moving. A fresh start. They don't need to know the details." "Not yet." Wendy looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for reassurance, for some sign that everything would be okay. But all she saw was fear, the same fear she felt deep in her bones. She nodded slowly, her voice quiet. "Okay. Let's pack." By nightfall, the Byrdes were on the road, leaving behind the bright lights and towering skyscrapers of Chicago for the rolling hills and quiet, wooded landscapes of the Missouri Ozarks. Charlotte and Jonah sat in the back seat, confused and angry. They didn't understand why their parents had suddenly uprooted their lives, and the explanation of a new opportunity didn't satisfy them. Charlotte crossed her arms, staring out the window in silence. She had just started to carve out a life for herself in Chicago, friends, high school, the city's endless energy. Now it was all gone, ripped away without warning. Jonah, on the other hand, was quieter, lost in his thoughts. He sensed something was off, but like Charlotte, he wasn't sure what. The drive was long and tense. Marty kept his eyes on the road, while Wendy stared out the passenger window, lost in her own thoughts. The reality of their situation weighed heavily on them both. There was no going back now. Their lives in Chicago were over. After hours of driving, they finally crossed into the Ozarks. The landscape changed dramatically, lush forests, calm lakes, and winding roads that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a world away from the hustle and bustle of the city. When they arrived at the small lakeside house Marty had rented, the sun was just beginning to set. The house was modest, nothing like their home in Chicago, but it would have to do. Marty stepped out of the car, taking in the view of the lake, the stillness of the water. It was beautiful in a way, but also unsettlingly quiet. Wendy joined him, wrapping her arms around herself as the cool evening air settled in. "This is it?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. Marty nodded, exhaling slowly. This is it. As the Byrdes unpacked their car, a sense of unease settled over them. This was their new beginning, their fresh start. But beneath the surface, Marty knew the truth. They weren't just running from the cartel, they were running from a life they could never return to. That night, as Marty lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread. He had promised Dell he would make the cartel's money in the Ozarks, but he didn't know how yet. This new life came with no guarantees. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He had saved his family's lives, but at what cost? They were trapped now, tethered to a new reality where every move would be under scrutiny. Wendy lay beside him, quiet, her back turned. They hadn't spoken much since the move, the tension between them palpable. She was angry, scared, and filled with uncertainty. Marty knew she blamed him, part of him blamed himself too. But it was too late for regrets. They had to survive. In the morning, Marty would need to start working on his plan, finding ways to move money through the Ozarks' sleepy small-town businesses. But for now, as he listened to the soft lapping of the lake against the shore, all he could think about was the looming threat of the cartel and the life they had left behind in Chicago. This was their new beginning. But in Marty's heart, he knew it was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. The early morning mist clung to the surface of the lake as the Byrdes awoke to their first full day in the Ozarks. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the urban hustle they had known in Chicago. It was quiet here, too quiet. The isolation wrapped around them like the mist, both comforting and unsettling. Marty stood at the window, staring out at the glassy water that stretched beyond their small lakeside house. It was beautiful, in a way, but far from the life they had known. The horizon seemed endless, and with it, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Wendy stirred beside him, groaning softly as she woke up. "Didn't sleep much," she muttered, rubbing her eyes. She glanced around the small bedroom with its dated furniture and worn wallpaper, feeling the weight of their new reality pressing in. "I know," Marty replied quietly. None of us did. Down the hall, Charlotte and Jonah were having their own reactions to the sudden, jarring change in their lives. Charlotte had barely unpacked, her frustration boiling beneath the surface. The Ozarks felt like a punishment to her, a world away from the fast-paced life she had built back in Chicago. Jonah, on the other hand, was more withdrawn. He wasn't angry like his sister, but the silence of the place unnerved him. He missed the comforting sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the distant voices of people. Here, it was just the wind and the rustling of trees. As the family gathered for breakfast, the sense of dislocation hung in the air. Wendy placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the table, but no one seemed eager to eat. Charlotte pushed her food around with her fork, staring out the window with a scowl. "I don't get why we had to come here," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with disdain. "There's literally nothing to do. We're in the middle of nowhere." Marty tried to muster a reassuring tone. "It's just going to take some time to adjust, Char. There's a lot of new things to explore. We're near the lake. Maybe we can rent a boat, do some fishing." Charlotte rolled her eyes. Yeah, because fishing is exactly what I want to do with my life. Wendy shot Marty a look, one that said don't push it. She turned to Charlotte, her voice calm but firm. This is where we are now. It's not forever. But we have to make it work. Jonah remained quiet, staring down at his plate. He could sense the tension between his parents, between his sister and the world around them. Everything felt off balance. After breakfast, Marty decided to take a drive into town, hoping to get a sense of the place and scope out any potential business opportunities. Wendy stayed behind to unpack, while Charlotte and Jonah wandered outside, exploring the wooded area around the house. It was all so unfamiliar, the towering trees, the stillness, the sense that they were alone. The town of Osage Beach, the nearest small town in the Ozarks, was as different from Chicago as night was from day. Marty drove slowly down the main street, taking in the modest storefronts, bait shops, diners, and gas stations. This was a place where people knew each other, where strangers stood out. As he parked in front of a diner, Marty caught sight of a few locals, men in trucker caps and worn denim, women in casual clothes chatting outside a small convenience store. They eyed his car curiously, noting the Illinois plates. Marty stepped out, feeling the weight of their glances. He wasn't from around here, and it was obvious. Inside the diner, the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. Marty slid into a booth near the window, pulling out his phone to check his emails, though there were none that could solve the real problems he faced. He needed to figure out how to launder money here, in a place that seemed to thrive on simplicity and small-town connections. As he sipped his coffee, a man approached his table, wiping his hands on a dish rag. He was in his late 50s, with a friendly but scrutinizing look in his eyes. "You're new here," the man said, sliding into the booth across from Marty without waiting for an invitation. Marty blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah, just moved in with my family." The man nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm Buddy. Own the place. Not often we get folks from Chicago round here. What brings you to the Ozarks?" Marty hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Work. Just looking for a fresh start, you know." Buddy raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying the vague explanation. "Fresh start, huh? Well, welcome to Osage Beach. It's quiet, but we like it that way." Marty smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. He could tell that people in a town this small didn't trust outsiders easily. But if he was going to make things work, he needed to start building relationships, even if they were built on half-truths. As Buddy got up to leave, he gave Marty a knowing look. "Be careful out here. It might seem quiet, but the Ozarks have a way of revealing things people try to hide." Marty nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure if it was a friendly warning or something more. Back at the lake house, Wendy was trying to keep busy. The isolation was starting to settle in, and with it, the realization of just how far they were from their old life. She unpacked boxes, trying to make the house feel more like home, but nothing felt right. The furniture was dated, the walls bare, and the space seemed to echo with the emptiness of their new existence. Charlotte had retreated to her room, headphones on, trying to block out the world. Jonah wandered along the lake's edge, fascinated by the wildlife but feeling the loneliness of the place. There was no one his age around, no neighborhood kids, no school friends. Just the endless stretch of water and the thick woods surrounding them. As the sun began to set, Marty returned home, his face weary. He didn't say much as he entered, just kissed Wendy on the cheek and sank into the worn couch. Wendy joined him, sitting beside him in the dim light. "How was it?" she asked quietly. Marty shrugged. "It's different. This is going to be harder than I thought." Wendy sighed, leaning her head back. "We'll figure it out. We don't have a choice." Marty glanced toward the window, where the lake shimmered in the fading light. They had left the chaos of Chicago behind, but now they faced a different kind of challenge, surviving in a place that was as foreign to them as the cartel's world was dangerous. The Ozarks had welcomed them with quiet, but beneath that stillness, Marty could feel the weight of their new life pressing in. It was only a matter of time before the real difficulties began. As night fell, the family settled into their uneasy routine. The sounds of the forest replaced the constant hum of the city, and the isolation wrapped around them tighter. They had entered the Ozarks with a sense of urgency, fleeing the past. Now, the remote wilderness would test their resilience and push them to their limits in ways they hadn't yet imagined. This was their new life, but none of them were ready for what lay ahead. The days in the Ozarks seemed to stretch endlessly, each one a reminder of how far removed the Byrdes were from their old lives. While the natural beauty of the area might have been serene to some, for Marty, it only heightened the anxiety building within him. The ticking clock in his mind was constant. He had to start laundering money, and soon, or the cartel's threats would come crashing down on him and his family. Marty sat at the kitchen table one morning, surrounded by papers and a laptop, reviewing local businesses in the area. The diner, the marina, the bait shops, everything was small, cash-heavy, but none of them felt like the key he needed. These places were run by people who had probably lived in the Ozarks their entire lives, wary of outsiders, and even warier of big city schemes. Marty had to figure out a way to blend in, to make these businesses work for him without raising suspicion. Wendy entered the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. She had been doing her best to adjust to their new life, but Marty could see the tension etched into her features. This wasn't what she had imagined for their family. But like him, she knew there was no other choice. "Any progress?" Wendy asked, though she already knew the answer. Marty shook his head. "It's harder than I thought it would be. These businesses, they're small. Too small for what we need. And the people here, they don't trust outsiders." Wendy sighed, leaning against the counter. "We don't have much time, Marty. The cartel's expecting you to start moving their money." "I know," Marty muttered, rubbing his temples. "But I can't just go in and start throwing cash around. That'll draw attention, and the last thing we need is the Fed sniffing around." Wendy watched him for a moment, her mind turning. "What about real estate? Land is cheap here, right? Maybe we could buy some property, start flipping houses, or invest in vacation rentals. It's cash heavy, and if we do it right, it won't raise too many eyebrows." Marty looked up, considering her suggestion. It was a good idea, but it would still take time they didn't have. Still, it was something. I'll look into it, he said finally. But we need something more immediate, something that can start funneling money now. Wendy nodded, though neither of them had a clear answer. The clock was ticking, and the weight of the cartel's expectations loomed over them like a dark cloud. Later that day, Marty decided to take a drive around the area, hoping that being out in the community might spark an idea. As he passed the various businesses, the marina, the bar, the pawn shop, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. He needed to get creative if he was going to make this work. His drive took him down a winding road toward a rundown strip club on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered, and the parking lot was half empty. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted tourists, but that wasn't what Marty was looking for. He pulled into the lot, shutting off the engine and staring at the building for a long moment. This was the kind of place that dealt in cash, lots of it, and it was off the radar enough to fly under the authorities' radar. If he could get in with the owner, this could be the break he needed. Marty stepped out of the car, his mind already racing with possibilities. Inside, the club was dimly lit, with the faint thrum of music playing in the background. The patrons were a mix of locals and drifters, and the atmosphere was one of quiet desperation. Marty approached the bar, ordering a drink while keeping an eye on the man he assumed was the owner, a burly guy with tattoos covering his arms, sitting in a corner booth, counting cash from a metal box. After a few minutes, Marty made his move, walking over to the man with a casual smile. "You the owner?" The man looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "Marty Byrde. I'm new around here, just moved in with my family," Marty said, extending a hand. "I was wondering if you might have a minute to talk business." The man raised an eyebrow, glancing Marty up and down before slowly shaking his hand. "Name's Bobby Dean. What kind of business you talking about?" Marty took a seat, leaning in slightly. "I'm in finance. I help people manage their money, keep things running smoothly. I've noticed places like yours could probably use some assistance with cash flow. I'm offering to help." Bobby Dean gave a humorless chuckle. "Finance, huh? In the Ozarks? You must be real desperate if you're coming to me." Marty smiled, unfazed. "Desperate, no. Smart, yes. Look, I know how things work in places like this. Cash businesses are tough to keep clean, and the IRS doesn't make it any easier. But I can help with that. I'm good at making money look clean." Bobby's eyes flickered with interest, but also caution. "You a money launderer?" Marty's smile didn't waver. "I'm a guy who knows how to move money, make things easier for people like you." There was a long pause as Bobby studied him. Marty knew the man wasn't stupid. He'd been running this club for a while, and he likely had his own ways of keeping the cash flowing without too much interference. But Marty also knew that someone like Bobby couldn't afford to pass up a good opportunity. Finally, Bobby leaned back in his seat, nodding slowly. "All right, Byrde. I'll bite. What exactly are you offering?" Marty's mind raced as he laid out the plan. He could funnel cartel money through the club's earnings, inflating profits while keeping Bobby's operation looking legitimate. In exchange, Bobby would get a cut, a lucrative deal for both of them. It would be the perfect way to start moving the cartel's cash without drawing too much attention, especially in a place like the Ozarks where businesses like this were off the grid. By the end of the conversation, Marty had secured his first foothold in the Ozarks, a partnership that would allow him to start laundering the cartel's money. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. Back at the lake house that evening, Marty relayed the day's events to Wendy, who listened carefully, her expression tense. "So, you think this guy is trustworthy?" Wendy asked, her voice low. "As trustworthy as anyone around here is," Marty replied. "We don't have many options, Wendy. This is the best shot we've got for now." Wendy sighed, rubbing her temples. "And what happens when the cartel wants more? When they start demanding more than we can move through this guy's business?" Marty didn't have an answer. He knew that this was just the beginning, and the cartel's demands would only grow. But for now, they had a foothold. He could only hope it would be enough to keep them alive. As he lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, the reality of their situation weighed heavily on him. The cartel was watching, waiting, and there was no margin for error. They had escaped Chicago, but the old problems had followed them here. Now, in this strange new place, Marty would have to walk a tightrope, balancing between survival and destruction. The clock was still ticking, and Marty knew that one misstep could cost them everything. The Byrdes had only been in the Ozarks for a few weeks, but the strain on the family was already showing, particularly with Charlotte and Jonah. The quiet isolation of their new home, coupled with the drastic changes in their lives, was starting to take a toll. Marty and Wendy were preoccupied with survival, focused on the cartel and the dangerous work Marty was doing, leaving their children to fend for themselves in this strange new environment. For Charlotte, the move felt like a punishment. She had left behind her friends, her school, and her life in Chicago, all without any explanation that made sense to her. The picturesque scenery of the Ozarks, with its rolling hills and glistening lake, only deepened her resentment. She wasn't interested in fishing, boating, or any of the outdoor activities the locals seemed to enjoy. She wanted out. One afternoon, Charlotte stood at the edge of the dock, staring out at the still water. She could hear the soft hum of a boat in the distance, but otherwise, it was silent. Too silent. She missed the noise of the city, the constant motion of people and traffic, the freedom to just walk down the street and get lost in the crowd. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a text from a number she didn't recognize. It was probably another local kid trying to befriend her. She ignored it. There were only a handful of teenagers in the area, and none of them seemed remotely interesting to her. Feeling trapped, Charlotte made a decision. She wasn't going to sit around and let this new life suffocate her. She needed to push back, to find a way out, or at least a way to feel like she had control again. Jonah, on the other hand, was dealing with the move in a quieter but equally troubling way. At first, he had been fascinated by the natural surroundings, exploring the woods behind their house, cataloging the animals he saw. But as the days dragged on, he too felt the growing tension in the air. He had always been a more introspective kid, but the move had made him even more withdrawn. He spent hours online, researching survival techniques and conspiracy theories, diving deep into the dark corners of the internet. He had always been curious about the world, but now his curiosity took a more dangerous turn. He began looking into money laundering, cartels, and the kind of world his father was involved in. The more he learned, the more disillusioned he became. Jonah didn't talk much to Charlotte about what he was doing, but he could sense that she was just as unhappy as he was. One evening, after dinner, he overheard his parents talking in hushed tones about the cartel, about how much money needed to be laundered, and about the danger they were still in. It was the first time Jonah truly understood the gravity of their situation. And it terrified him. The next day, Charlotte decided to skip school. She couldn't stand another day of forced small talk with kids she didn't connect with. She hopped on a local bus and headed toward a nearby town, far enough away that no one would recognize her. She didn't have a plan, just the overwhelming need to get away. When she arrived, she wandered the streets, eventually finding herself at a gas station on the outskirts of town. There, she met a group of older teenagers, kids who clearly didn't care about school or the rules. They were drinking, smoking, and blasting music from the back of a rusty pickup truck. They were wild and free, everything Charlotte wanted to feel. One of the boys, a tall guy with a buzz cut and a tattoo peeking out from under his shirt, noticed Charlotte lingering nearby and waved her over. "Hey, you're not from around here, are you?" he asked, handing her a beer. Charlotte hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "Nope. Just moved in. This place sucks." The boy grinned. "Yeah, well, it ain't much, but we know how to have fun. I'm Wyatt, by the way." "Charlotte," she replied, taking the beer and sitting down with the group. As the afternoon wore on, Charlotte felt a sense of release. She drank, laughed, and for the first time since moving to the Ozarks, she didn't feel so trapped. But beneath the surface, she knew this wasn't the kind of life she wanted. It was a distraction, a rebellion against her parents, against everything that had happened. But it wasn't a solution. Meanwhile, Jonah's rebellion was more private, but no less dangerous. He had started snooping through Marty's files, accessing financial records he didn't fully understand but knew were important. He spent hours late at night, researching laundering schemes and how money moved through the shadowy world his father was now entrenched in. His curiosity quickly morphed into something darker, a desire to understand the very forces that had ripped his family apart. One evening, while scrolling through some obscure forums on the dark web, Jonah stumbled across a post about the Navarro cartel. The post was filled with rumors, conspiracy theories, and encrypted messages. His heart raced as he clicked through the pages. He knew he was in over his head, but he couldn't stop. Part of him felt like he needed to know, to arm himself with knowledge in case things went wrong. It wasn't long before Jonah's online activity caught the attention of someone dangerous. He received an anonymous message, cryptic but menacing: "Careful where you tread, kid. Some things aren't meant to be found." Jonah froze, staring at the screen. He didn't respond, but the fear lingered long after he logged off. He knew he was getting too close to something he shouldn't be involved in, but the thrill of it kept pulling him back. Over the next few weeks, the tension between Charlotte and her parents reached a boiling point. Marty and Wendy noticed the late nights, the missed school days, and the new group of friends Charlotte was hanging around with. One evening, after Charlotte came home past curfew, Wendy confronted her. "What's going on with you, Charlotte? You're skipping school, hanging out with people you barely know, and now you're sneaking out. This isn't like you." Charlotte glared at her mother, her arms crossed. "What do you expect? You ripped us out of our lives and dumped us in the middle of nowhere. You and Dad are so focused on whatever shady stuff you're doing, you don't even care about us." Marty, standing in the doorway, tried to step in. "We're doing this to protect you. It's not safe for us back in Chicago. You need to understand that." "Protect us? From what? You won't even tell us what's really going on." Charlotte shouted, her voice cracking with anger. Jonah, who had been listening from the hallway, quietly backed away. He felt the same frustration as Charlotte, but he had chosen a different way to cope. He retreated to his room, turning his focus back to the computer screen, where the anonymous message still haunted him. Charlotte's rebellion continued to escalate, and Jonah's descent into the dark side of the internet became more dangerous. Both of them were pushing back against the suffocating control they felt from their parents and the forced move to the Ozarks. As they formed new, questionable friendships and explored risky behavior, Marty and Wendy struggled to keep the family from unraveling. This was more than just typical teenage rebellion. Charlotte and Jonah were reacting to the very real dangers surrounding them. The cartel's influence loomed large, even if they couldn't fully grasp its implications. And as their defiance grew, so did the risk that they would unintentionally expose their family's secrets, drawing attention from the wrong people in a place where trust was hard to come by. The Byrdes had begun to settle into their new life in the Ozarks, though settling was a relative term. Marty's focus remained on securing business ventures to keep the cartel money flowing, while Wendy tried to manage the household and maintain a sense of normalcy for the kids. But nothing about their life in the Ozarks was normal, especially after their first run-in with the Langmore family. The Langmores had lived in the Ozarks for generations, and they were known for being trouble. The family's patriarch, Cade Langmore, had a long criminal history and was a constant source of tension in the community. His niece, Ruth Langmore, however, was different, smart, cunning, and far more ambitious than the rest of her family. She had spent her life watching her father, uncles, and cousins get into one bad deal after another, always skirting the law but never rising above their station. Ruth wanted more, and she saw Marty Byrde as her ticket to something better. Marty had heard whispers about the Langmores from the locals, warnings to steer clear of them and their schemes. But in the world Marty was operating in, danger and opportunity often came hand in hand. He didn't seek out the Langmores, but it wasn't long before they crossed paths. It started when Ruth spotted Marty meeting with Bobby Dean, the strip club owner. She had been working as a waitress at the club, doing odd jobs and skimming a little off the top whenever she could. She had seen plenty of shady deals in her time, but there was something different about Marty. He didn't fit the usual profile of a low-level criminal trying to make a quick buck. He was sharp, polished, and from what she overheard, dealing with some serious money. Ruth's interest was piqued. She knew money when she saw it, and Marty Byrde screamed money. She didn't know exactly what he was into, but whatever it was big. And big meant opportunity. One afternoon, Marty was at the dock by the lake house, making calls and trying to set up more laundering operations. As he hung up the phone, he noticed a small figure walking down the path toward him. It was Ruth. Marty had seen her around town a few times, but they had never spoken directly. She was young, barely out of her teens, with a tough, no-nonsense demeanor that didn't match her slight frame. She had the look of someone who had grown up hard, always fighting for survival. "You're Marty Byrde, right?" Ruth said, not bothering with pleasantries. Marty nodded, wary. "Yeah. And you are?" "Ruth Langmore." "I know you've been meeting with Bobby Dean," she said, cutting straight to the point. "He's not the smartest guy around here, but he knows how to move cash. I'm guessing you need someone like that." Marty narrowed his eyes. He wasn't used to being approached so directly, especially by someone like Ruth. "And what's it to you?" Ruth crossed her arms, her chin lifted defiantly. "I'm just saying, I know this area better than anyone. You're new here, and if you're planning on doing business, you're gonna need someone who knows how things work around here. I could be useful to you." Marty sized her up, his mind racing through the possibilities. Ruth was clearly smart, smarter than the average local criminal, and she seemed to know a lot more than she was letting on. But involving her, or any Langmore for that matter, could be risky. He had learned enough to know that the Langmores weren't to be trusted. Still, there was something about Ruth's boldness that intrigued him. He needed people who could help him navigate the local landscape, and Ruth, with her connections and street smarts, might just be the edge he needed. "I'll think about it," Marty said finally. Ruth smirked, as if she knew she had already won him over. "You do that. I'll be around." Ruth didn't waste any time. She began hanging around the businesses Marty had his eye on, listening, watching, and waiting for her opportunity. She had grown up around crime, but this was different. Marty was playing at a much higher level, and if she could get in on the action, it could change her life. She wanted out of the cycle her family was trapped in: poverty, petty crime, and dead-end schemes. Marty Byrde represented something she had never had before, a way-up.at home. Ruth faced resistance from her own family. Cade, her uncle, was freshly out of prison and already plotting his next scam. He didn't trust anyone, least of all a big city guy like Marty. But Ruth didn't care what Cade thought. She had her own plans, and she wasn't going to let anyone, family or not, stand in her way. One evening, as Ruth sat in her trailer, flipping through one of Marty's financial ledgers she had managed to borrow from the club, Cade walked in, his face red with anger. "What the hell are you doing with that?" Cade demanded, snatching the ledger from her hands. Ruth stood her ground, unfazed. "I'm working on something. Something bigger than anything you've ever done." "Bigger? You think this guy's gonna let you in on his deals? He'll chew you up and spit you out," Cade snarled. Ruth's jaw tightened. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll be the one to outsmart him." Cade laughed, shaking his head. "You're just like your old man. Always thinking you're smarter than everyone else." Ruth didn't flinch. She had learned a long time ago that she couldn't rely on anyone but herself. Cade could talk all he wanted, but she was going to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. And Marty Byrde was the key to that. Over the next few weeks, Ruth became a regular fixture in Marty's world. She made herself indispensable, running errands, keeping an eye on local competition, and helping smooth over dealings with local businesses that were hesitant to work with an outsider like Marty. Slowly, she gained his trust, though Marty never let her in on the full extent of his operations. Wendy, on the other hand, remained suspicious of Ruth. She had grown up in a different world, and the Langmores represented everything she had always been taught to avoid. But Marty assured her that Ruth was a useful ally, even if she was dangerous. "She's smart, Wendy," Marty said one evening after Ruth had left. "And she knows how to navigate this place. We need her." Wendy wasn't convinced. "She's a Langmore, Marty. You can't trust her." "I'm not trusting her," Marty said, his voice firm. "I'm using her. There's a difference." As Ruth became more involved with Marty's operation, her ambition grew. She wanted more than just a few small tasks or errands. She wanted a real piece of the action. She began to push Marty for bigger responsibilities, hinting that she could do more than just be his eyes and ears around town. "You don't need Bobby Dean or those other idiots," Ruth said one day, standing in Marty's office. "I can run things for you. I know this place better than anyone, and I'm smarter than any of them. You need someone like me." Marty studied her for a long moment. He knew Ruth was ambitious, but he also knew that giving her too much control could be dangerous. She was hungry, and that hunger could turn against him if he wasn't careful. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, Ruth," Marty said carefully. "But this is a big operation, and it's dangerous. I'm not sure you understand what you're getting into." Ruth's eyes flashed with determination. "I know exactly what I'm getting into. And I'm not afraid." Marty sighed, leaning back in his chair. He could see the fire in Ruth, the drive to prove herself. It reminded him of himself, in a way. But there was a fine line between ambition and recklessness, and he wasn't sure which side Ruth would fall on. "We'll see," he said finally. Marty Byrde had underestimated just how difficult it would be to launder millions of dollars in the quiet, remote Missouri Ozarks. The region's slow economy, the lack of high-volume businesses, and the general wariness of outsiders were all working against him. The task that seemed daunting from the start was quickly becoming overwhelming, and the cartel's patience was running thin. The Ozarks had its charm, with its peaceful lakes, dense forests, and tight-knit communities. But for Marty, the idyllic setting was a logistical nightmare. Back in Chicago, laundering money was easier. The constant flow of transactions, the larger economy, and the anonymity of the city made it ideal for hiding illicit funds. But here, in this sleepy region, every dollar spent stood out. Marty had tried to invest in local businesses, like the Blue Cat Lodge and the Lickety-Split Strip Club, but the returns were nowhere near enough to keep up with the demands of the Navarro cartel. The businesses themselves were barely turning a profit, let alone able to funnel millions of dollars. Every day that passed without progress felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the moment when the cartel would lose their patience. And when that moment came, Marty knew there would be consequences that would fall on him and his family. It wasn't long before the calls from the cartel started coming more frequently. Each conversation with their contact, Dell, became more terse, more aggressive. Marty could hear the tension in Dell's voice every time he asked for a status update. "So, Marty," Dell said during their latest call, his tone calm but icy, "we've been patient. But patience isn't infinite. You assured us that relocating to the Ozarks would be a good move. So far, I'm not seeing any results." Marty rubbed his temple, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. "I know things have been slow, but I've got some deals in the works. I'm expanding operations, looking for new opportunities. I just need a little more time." Dell's laugh on the other end of the line was cold. "Time? Marty, time is not something you have a lot of. The Navarro cartel doesn't like excuses. You said you could move the money, and you're going to move the money. Now, you've got until the end of the month to show us real progress, or we're going to have to reassess your situation." The call ended abruptly, leaving Marty staring at the phone. He felt a knot form in his stomach. He was running out of time, and the reality was sinking in. The Ozarks might not be able to sustain the level of laundering the cartel needed. Back at the house, Wendy could sense Marty's growing frustration. He spent long nights in his makeshift office, poring over financial statements, making calls, and trying to devise a plan to keep everything afloat. The once confident, quick-witted financial advisor was beginning to show cracks in his facade. One evening, Wendy approached him, her voice soft but firm. "Marty, we need to talk. You're not sleeping, and the kids are starting to notice." "What's going on?" Marty leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with his hands. He felt the weight of everything crashing down on him, the move, the pressure from the cartel, the constant need to stay one step ahead. "It's the money, Wendy. The businesses aren't bringing in enough. I can't launder what we don't have. And the cartel is breathing down my neck." Wendy sat down across from him, her eyes searching his. "What about the Blue Cat Lodge? Lickety-splits? We put a lot of money into them. They're not pulling in enough cash flow," Marty replied, his voice strained. "The economy here is slower than I thought. We're not getting enough customers, and the locals don't trust me. It's going to take time to build up business, but I don't have time. The cartel wants results now." Wendy frowned, deep in thought. She knew that if Marty couldn't figure this out, the consequences would be catastrophic. "We need to find a way to generate more business. Maybe we should reach out to some of the locals, find partners. People who already have established businesses. If we can get them on our side, it might help." Marty nodded, though he wasn't sure where to start. The locals were suspicious of him as an outsider, and it would take more than a business proposal to win their trust. But Wendy was right, they needed to expand, fast. The next day, Marty met with Ruth Langmore at the Blue Cat Lodge. Ruth had been pushing for more responsibility in his operation, and Marty was beginning to see the value in her connections. She knew the area, knew the people, and understood how things worked here in a way Marty didn't. "We've got a problem," Marty said, sitting across from Ruth in the dimly lit office of the lodge. "The businesses aren't bringing in enough money, and the cartel is getting impatient. We need to ramp up, fast." Ruth leaned back in her chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. You should have figured that out by now, Marty. These people don't trust you. You're not one of them. But me? I've been here my whole life. I know how to get things moving. Marty's gaze narrowed. I'm listening. I've got some connections with a few guys who run some side businesses, construction, scrap metal, things like that. They're not exactly clean, but they move a lot of cash. If we can convince them to funnel some of that through your operations, we can increase the volume. Marty considered the offer. It was risky. Bringing in more local criminals could complicate things and draw unwanted attention. But at this point, he didn't have many options. He needed more cash flowing through his system, and fast. Do you trust these guys? Marty asked. Ruth shrugged. As much as I trust anyone around here. They're not gonna screw you over if they think there's something in it for them. But you're gonna have to get your hands a little dirtier. Marty sighed, knowing that this was the kind of world he was now living in. Set it up. Let's see what we can do. With Ruth's help, Marty started expanding his operation, bringing in more cash-heavy businesses that could funnel money through his laundromat, strip club, and lodge. It wasn't long before the cash flow started to pick up, and Marty began to see some light at the end of the tunnel. But the added risk brought new problems. More people involved meant more opportunities for things to go wrong. The slow economy of the Ozarks still loomed large, and while Marty had managed to buy himself some time, he knew it wasn't enough to keep the cartel satisfied for long. The pressure was mounting, and the weight of it all was beginning to crush him. As the deadline from the cartel approached, Marty found himself working around the clock, trying to stay ahead of the problems that seemed to multiply with every new deal. Wendy stepped in where she could, helping to manage the day-to-day operations and keep up appearances, but the strain was visible on both of them. One evening, as Marty sat at his desk, surrounded by paperwork and ledgers, Wendy came into the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're going to get through this," she said, though her voice betrayed the uncertainty they both felt. Marty didn't respond right away. He stared down at the numbers in front of him, the constant churn of figures that represented the precarious balance they were living in. Finally, he nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The quiet, strategic support Wendy Byrde had provided from the sidelines was no longer enough. The pressure was mounting, and while Marty was buried in numbers and scrambling to keep the cartel off their backs, Wendy saw that their survival depended on more than just managing the money. It was about power, influence, and control. She had spent her life navigating tough situations, and this one was no different. Wendy decided it was time to step up and take a more active role in their growing criminal enterprise. It started subtly at first. Wendy had always been involved in the business, but mostly on the periphery, organizing logistics, taking care of the family, and offering advice when Marty was overwhelmed. But she had ideas, big ideas, and a growing sense that Marty's approach, careful, methodical, but often too reactive, wasn't going to be enough. The cartel wasn't going to wait for slow economic improvements in the Ozarks. They needed bold moves. Wendy's transformation began one evening as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at Marty's spreadsheets and projections. The numbers weren't adding up, and the stress of balancing multiple fronts was wearing Marty down. She watched as he paced back and forth, talking on the phone with Dell, trying to explain the delays in their money laundering operations. As Marty ended the call, visibly frustrated, Wendy spoke up. "Marty, we're not going to survive this if we keep playing small. We can't just react to problems. We need to control them. We need to expand." Marty looked at her, confused and exhausted. "Expand? We can barely manage what we've got going now. How are we supposed to grow?" Wendy leaned forward, her voice calm but decisive. "You're thinking too small. We need bigger investments, bigger businesses. Something that will bring in more cash flow and establish us as real players in this region. If we want to stay ahead of the cartel, we have to take control of the local economy." Wendy didn't waste any time. While Marty focused on the day-to-day operations, Wendy began making moves behind the scenes. She reached out to local politicians, business leaders, and community influencers, leveraging her natural charm and political savvy. She knew that in a place like the Ozarks, relationships were everything. And where Marty had struggled to gain the locals' trust, Wendy excelled. She had a way of connecting with people, understanding their needs, and offering them solutions that made them feel valued. One of Wendy's first targets was Charles Wilkes, a wealthy and influential local businessman with deep ties to the community. Wilkes owned several key properties and businesses in the area, and Wendy knew that forming an alliance with him could open doors they desperately needed. At first, Wilkes was hesitant to get involved with the Byrdes. He had heard the rumors about their sudden move from Chicago, and while he was no stranger to shady business dealings, he preferred to keep his hands clean. But Wendy was persistent. She met with him multiple times, presenting the idea of expanding his business portfolio with lucrative new ventures, casinos, real estate developments, and tourism projects that could bring more wealth and influence to the region. "I know you're cautious, Charles," Wendy said during one of their meetings, her voice smooth and persuasive. "But we're talking about revitalizing the entire lakefront. With your backing, we could bring in more tourists, more investors. The Ozarks could be a destination, not just a pit stop. And you could be at the center of that transformation." Wilkes, intrigued by Wendy's vision and impressed by her boldness, agreed to explore the idea further. The seeds of a partnership were planted, and Wendy knew this was just the beginning. Back at home, Wendy's increasing involvement in the business began to shift the family dynamic. Marty, who had always been the one calling the shots, now found himself sharing the decision-making process with Wendy. She wasn't just offering suggestions anymore, she was making moves, securing deals, and building alliances. And while part of Marty was relieved to have her help, another part of him felt uneasy about how quickly Wendy was taking control. One evening, after a particularly long day, Marty and Wendy sat on the porch of their lake house, the sound of crickets filling the air. "You've been doing a lot more lately," Marty said, his tone cautious but curious. "Getting involved in ways you didn't before." Wendy took a sip of her wine and nodded. "Because we need to think bigger, Marty. The cartel isn't going to wait for us to figure things out. We're on borrowed time. If we want to survive, we need power, real power. Not just enough to scrape by." Marty frowned, unsure of how to respond. It's dangerous, Wendy. The more we expand, the more attention we draw. The cartel isn't the only threat. There are people watching, the FBI. Wendy's gaze was steady. I know the risks. But the only way we get out of this alive is if we control everything. We don't just survive, Marty. We thrive. That's how we protect our family. Her words lingered in the air, and Marty realized that Wendy wasn't just stepping up, she was evolving. She was becoming a force in her own right, and there was a part of him that didn't know how to deal with it. Wendy's ambition led her to propose one of the most daring ideas yet, opening a casino on the lakefront. It would be the perfect way to launder large sums of money while also generating legitimate revenue. Casinos attracted high volumes of cash transactions, and with the right political backing, it could become a goldmine for the Byrdes. She presented the idea to Marty one evening after the kids had gone to bed. A casino? Marty said, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. Wendy, that's huge. It's not just a business, it's a magnet for attention, from regulators, from law enforcement. That's exactly why it's perfect, Wendy interrupted. A casino brings in legitimate money, and it's the kind of business that can sustain the level of laundering we need. We'll be able to move millions without anyone batting an eye. But we need to act now before someone else does. Marty stared at her, trying to process the scale of what she was suggesting. He knew she was right. If they could pull it off, it would solve a lot of their problems. But it would also make them even bigger targets. Are you sure we can make this work? Marty asked, his voice tinged with both fear and admiration. Wendy's eyes gleamed with determination. I've already started laying the groundwork. I've got Charles Wilkes on board, and I'm meeting with the right people to get the permits. We can do this, Marty. We can make this our empire. Wendy's bold moves were starting to pay off. She had convinced Wilkes to invest in the casino project, and with his political connections, they were making progress on getting the necessary approvals. Wendy's growing influence in the local community also meant that more people were starting to see the Byrdes as legitimate businesspeople, rather than suspicious outsiders. But with Wendy's rise came new risks. Her ambition was starting to attract attention, not just from the cartel, but from law enforcement and local rivals who didn't want to see outsiders take control of their territory. The FBI, already keeping a close eye on the Byrdes, began to tighten their surveillance, sensing that something big was in the works. As Wendy continued to push forward with the casino plan, she found herself facing new challenges, ethical dilemmas, dangerous alliances, and the growing realization that the deeper she went, the harder it would be to turn back. But Wendy wasn't one to back down. She was in too deep now, and there was no turning back. As Wendy's ambitious casino project began to take shape, Marty Byrde realized that their success would hinge on more than just financial maneuvering. The local politics of the Ozarks were a complex web of power, influence, and rivalry. Navigating this landscape required a delicate balance of charm, negotiation, and strategic alliances. Marty found himself entangled with local politicians and law enforcement, each interaction adding layers of complexity to their operation. Marty's first major step into the world of local politics was a meeting with Mayor Carl Hargrove. Hargrove was a seasoned politician, known for his connections and his ability to make things happen, or prevent them from happening. If the Byrdes wanted to get the necessary permits and support for their casino, Hargrove was the man they needed to impress. Wendy arranged the meeting, and Marty spent days preparing for it. He knew that convincing Hargrove would require more than just presenting a business plan. It would require understanding his motivations and addressing his concerns. The meeting took place in the mayor's office, a room decorated with portraits of past local leaders and filled with the smell of cigar smoke. Hargrove, a rotund man with a gruff demeanor, greeted Marty with a nod. "Mr. Byrde," Hargrove said, his voice gravelly. "I've heard a lot about your plans. You're talking about a major investment in our community." "That's right, Mayor," Marty replied, taking a seat across from Hargrove. "We're looking to bring a significant boost to the local economy, create jobs, and revitalize the lakefront area." Hargrove raised an eyebrow. "And what's in it for me?" Marty took a deep breath. "We're prepared to make substantial contributions to local charities, sponsor community events, and work closely with local businesses. In exchange, we need your support to expedite the permitting process and help us navigate any regulatory hurdles." Hargrove's eyes narrowed as he considered the offer. "And how do I know you're not just another outsider looking to make a quick buck and leave us with a mess?" Marty met his gaze steadily. "You don't. But I can assure you that our commitment to this project is serious. We're in it for the long haul, and we want to build something that benefits everyone." Hargrove leaned back in his chair, puffing on his cigar. "I'll think about it. But don't expect any favors. You'll need to prove yourself." Marty left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. He knew that gaining Hargrove's support wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that it was a crucial step in moving forward with their plans. The next challenge came from an unexpected source: Sheriff Gene Raines. Raines was the local law enforcement officer who had a reputation for being both shrewd and incorruptible. His presence in the community was strong, and he was known for keeping a tight grip on crime and corruption. Marty had hoped to avoid drawing Raines's attention, but with the casino project moving forward, it was inevitable. Raines had a reputation for being meticulous and wary of any new developments that could disrupt the status quo. Marty's first encounter with Raines was at a town hall meeting where Raines was speaking about community safety and crime prevention. After the meeting, Marty approached him, trying to keep the conversation friendly and professional. "Sheriff Raines," Marty said, extending his hand. "I'm Marty Byrde. I wanted to introduce myself and discuss our upcoming project." Raines shook his hand, his expression guarded. "I've heard about your casino project. What do you need from me?" Marty tried to keep his tone respectful. "I wanted to assure you that we're committed to following all local regulations and working closely with law enforcement. We want to be a positive force in the community." Raines studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I appreciate your offer, but I'll be keeping a close eye on things. We've had our share of troublemakers in this town, and I'm not going to let anyone disrupt the peace we've worked hard to maintain." Marty knew that Raines wasn't going to be an easy ally, but he also understood that earning his trust could help mitigate potential legal complications. He promised to keep open lines of communication and ensure that the casino adhered to all legal requirements. As Marty worked on building relationships with local politicians and law enforcement, he encountered both support and resistance. Some business owners saw the casino as a potential boon to the area, bringing new opportunities and customers. Others, however, were wary of the disruption it could bring to the established order. One business owner, Tom Caldwell, ran a small but successful antique shop on the outskirts of town. Caldwell was known for his conservative views and his reluctance to embrace new developments. When Marty approached him to discuss potential partnerships, Caldwell was initially skeptical. "I don't see why we need a casino," Caldwell said, shaking his head. "This town has been doing just fine without one." Marty remained calm. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Caldwell. But the casino could bring in more visitors, which means more customers for all local businesses. We're not looking to take over, we're looking to enhance the area." Caldwell was unconvinced, but after a few more discussions and a promise to include local businesses in the project's plans, he began to warm up to the idea. He agreed to consider the benefits and to stay open to future discussions. As the casino project gained momentum, Marty found himself navigating a complex web of local politics. He had to balance the interests of politicians, law enforcement, and local business owners, all while trying to maintain a facade of legitimacy. The local political landscape was fraught with rivalries and shifting alliances. Marty learned to read between the lines, to identify allies who could help push his agenda and opponents who needed to be carefully managed. Every conversation, every deal, and every negotiation was a step in a high-stakes game of influence and control. By the end of this chapter, Marty had managed to secure some key support for the casino project, but not without making new enemies and facing unexpected challenges. His efforts to navigate the local political landscape had made him a more formidable player, but they also highlighted the risks and complexities of his position. The casino project was gaining traction, but it was clear that Marty's path was far from smooth. The stakes were high, and the consequences of failure were looming ever closer. Ruth Langmore had always been a force to be reckoned with in the Ozarks, a tenacious and sharp-witted young woman who knew how to navigate the region's rough edges. Her involvement with the Byrdes operations began as a way to establish her own foothold in the criminal underworld, but it quickly evolved into a more significant role. As the casino project moved forward, Ruth's relationship with Marty Byrde deepened, and her rise within the Byrdes operation began to create rifts with her own family. Ruth's ascent within the Byrdes business was marked by her relentless drive and resourcefulness. Marty had initially seen her as a useful, if somewhat unpredictable, asset. However, Ruth's ability to manage and expand operations with a blend of street smarts and business acumen quickly made her indispensable. One day, as Ruth walked into Marty's makeshift office at the Blue Cat Lodge, she found him hunched over financial documents, looking weary. "Got something for you," Ruth said, dropping a stack of papers on his desk. "I've been working on a plan to clean up some of the cash flow issues. We've got a few new opportunities for laundering money through local construction projects and some off-the-books real estate deals." Marty looked up, a hint of surprise and appreciation in his eyes. "You've been busy. I wasn't expecting this much initiative." Ruth shrugged, her face a mix of confidence and determination. I know what I'm doing, Marty. I've got connections that you don't, and I can make things happen that you wouldn't even know about. Marty nodded, impressed. All right, let's see what you've got. As Ruth explained her plan, Marty couldn't help but be impressed by her strategic thinking. She had a knack for finding hidden opportunities and navigating the local landscape in ways that Marty's more conventional approach had missed. Her role had evolved from a mere facilitator to a key player in the Byrdes' operations. However, Ruth's rise wasn't without consequences. Her increasing influence within the Byrdes' operation began to draw scrutiny and resentment from her own family, the Langmores. Her cousin, Wyatt, and her uncle, Jacob, were particularly vocal about their displeasure. The Langmore family had long held sway over the local criminal scene, and Ruth's new position threatened their established power. One evening, Ruth was at the Langmore family trailer, discussing the latest developments with her uncle. Jacob Langmore was a burly man with a no-nonsense attitude. He was known for his gruff demeanor and his strong control over the family's criminal activities. I hear you're making quite a name for yourself with the Byrdes, Jacob said, his voice heavy with suspicion. You've been busy, Ruth. Too busy. Ruth tried to keep her tone steady. I'm just doing what's necessary. The Byrdes have a big project coming up, and it's important that I handle things right. Jacob's gaze was steely. We've been managing our operations just fine without your fancy plans. What do you think you're doing, going behind our backs and cozying up with them? Ruth clenched her fists, her patience wearing thin. I'm doing what's best for all of us. The Byrdes have resources and connections that we don't. If we play it right, it could mean a lot more for the Langmores in the long run. Wyatt Langmore, Ruth's cousin, chimed in from the corner of the room. Maybe you're getting too big for your britches, Ruth. We're the Langmores. We don't need to be playing second fiddle to anyone. Ruth's eyes flashed with anger. I'm not playing second fiddle. I'm trying to make sure we all benefit from this. If you guys can't see that, then maybe you're not looking hard enough. The argument grew heated, with Jacob and Wyatt insisting that Ruth was overstepping her bounds. Ruth, however, was resolute. She knew that her involvement with the Byrdes could bring substantial gains, and she wasn't about to let family tensions derail her plans. Despite the family discord, Ruth's role within the Byrdes operation continued to grow. Marty increasingly relied on her to manage local dealings and oversee various aspects of the business. Ruth's ability to bridge the gap between the Byrdes and the local community proved invaluable. One day, Ruth met with Marty to discuss a new development, a potential partnership with a local construction firm that could help with laundering money through renovation projects. This firm is legit, Ruth said, laying out her research. They've got the contracts and the cash flow we need. We can funnel money through their operations and make it look clean. Marty reviewed the documents, nodding in approval. You've done a great job, Ruth. This could be a game changer for us. Ruth's eyes sparkled with determination. I'm on it. I'll make sure everything goes smoothly. As Ruth left the office, she felt a mix of satisfaction and tension. Her role within the Byrdes operation was secure, but the growing divide with her family weighed heavily on her. She knew that her success came at a cost, and the more she aligned herself with Marty and his plans, the more she alienated the people she had grown up with. Wendy Byrde's growing ambition had begun to clash with Marty's cautious approach, creating a rift in their marriage. The strain of keeping their illegal activities hidden from their children, Charlotte and Jonah, as well as their new neighbors in the Ozarks, was mounting. The dual pressure of maintaining a facade of normalcy while managing an increasingly complex criminal enterprise took its toll on the Byrde family. The Byrdes' new life in the Ozarks was a juggling act of deception and pragmatism. Wendy's enthusiasm for expanding their business and asserting control was in stark contrast to Marty's careful, defensive strategy. Their differences came to a head one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork and empty coffee cups. "Marty, we need to move faster on this," Wendy said, her voice sharp with frustration. "The casino's not going to build itself, and we're falling behind. We have to take risks to make this work." Marty rubbed his temples, his expression weary. "I understand, Wendy, but we have to be careful. The more aggressive we are, the more attention we draw. We're already walking a tightrope. If we make one wrong move, it could all come crashing down." Wendy slammed her hand on the table, startling Marty. "I'm not talking about being reckless. I'm talking about being proactive. If we don't seize the opportunity, we'll be stuck in this small town forever, with nothing to show for it." Marty's gaze was steady but troubled. "And what about our family? Charlotte and Jonah are already struggling to adjust. If they find out what's really going on, it could destroy them. We have to protect them from this." Wendy's eyes flashed with frustration. "We're protecting them by giving them a better future. They need to understand that sometimes sacrifices have to be made. They're old enough to handle the truth." Marty's face hardened. "No. We keep them out of this. We've promised ourselves that they won't be part of this world." The tension between Wendy and Marty was mirrored by the growing strain in their interactions with their children. Charlotte and Jonah, feeling the weight of their disrupted lives, began to notice the inconsistencies and oddities in their parents' behavior. Charlotte, now a high school junior, had taken to investigating the oddities she observed. One evening, she stumbled upon a hidden drawer in her parents' study, filled with documents and financial statements she didn't understand but knew were unusual. Her curiosity was piqued, and she began to question her parents more closely. "Mom, Dad," Charlotte said one night at dinner, her voice edged with suspicion. "What's going on? Why do you always seem so tense, and why are there so many strange papers in your study?" Wendy and Marty exchanged a quick, tense glance. Marty cleared his throat, trying to keep his tone calm. "It's just work stuff, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." Charlotte wasn't convinced. "It seems like there's something you're not telling us. Why are you both so stressed all the time?" Wendy forced a smile. "We're just adjusting to our new life. It's a big change for all of us, but we're making it work." Charlotte, still skeptical, nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but if there's something going on, I want to know. We're a family, and I feel like we're being kept in the dark." Meanwhile, Jonah, the younger of the two, was struggling with his own set of problems. He had become increasingly withdrawn and irritable, often shutting himself away in his room. The isolation only deepened when he stumbled upon a suspicious conversation between his parents and Ruth Langmore. One afternoon, Jonah overheard Ruth discussing the casino project in hushed tones with Marty and Wendy. The conversation, though vague, was filled with terms and references that Jonah didn't fully understand but knew were not part of everyday conversation. Jonah's mind raced with questions and fears. He felt trapped between his growing suspicion and his desire to support his parents. The secrets they were keeping from him were creating a rift, making him feel alienated and unsure of whom to trust. The Byrdes' efforts to maintain their cover extended to their interactions with their new neighbors as well. The local community was both curious and suspicious about the newcomers, and the Byrdes had to carefully navigate their social interactions. One evening, Wendy attended a neighborhood gathering at the home of Charles Wilkes, the influential businessman who had agreed to support their casino project. The gathering was meant to be a social event, but Wendy used it as an opportunity to further ingratiate herself with key local figures. As she mingled with the other guests, she was approached by Marcia Hargrove, the mayor's wife. Marcia was friendly but had an inquisitive nature that made Wendy uneasy. "Wendy, you're really making waves around here," Marcia said with a warm smile. "Everyone's talking about the new project you're working on. How's it going?" Wendy smiled politely, her mind racing to maintain the facade. "It's going well, thank you. We're excited about the potential and looking forward to making a positive impact on the community." Marcia's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "You know, it's interesting how quickly things are moving. It's not every day we see such rapid development. What's the secret to your success?" Wendy's smile tightened. "Just hard work and dedication. We're committed to contributing to the local economy and making a difference." The pressure of maintaining their secrecy was taking its toll on the Byrde family. The strain was evident in their interactions, and the cracks in their carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. Wendy's ambition and Marty's caution created an ongoing conflict, while their children's growing awareness and their neighbors' scrutiny added layers of complexity to their situation. The Byrde family's tight-knit structure began to unravel as Charlotte and Jonah dug deeper into their parents' hidden world. Their growing awareness of the criminal activities that their parents were involved in created a rift within the family, leading to tensions and confrontations that exposed the fractures in their once unified front. Charlotte's discovery of the hidden drawer in her parents' study had only been the beginning. Driven by her suspicions and the increasing strain at home, she began to piece together the fragments of information she had uncovered. Late one night, after her parents had gone to bed, she sat in her room with her laptop, researching terms and figures from the documents. Her research led her to a series of articles about money laundering and organized crime, revealing the scope of her parents' operations. The more she read, the clearer it became that their seemingly ordinary life was a front for something far more sinister. Charlotte's sense of betrayal and fear grew as the details fell into place. She knew she couldn't confront her parents directly without understanding the full extent of their involvement. Instead, she decided to confide in Jonah, hoping that together they could make sense of the situation. The following day, Charlotte and Jonah met in their shared bedroom, a space that had become their sanctuary from the turmoil outside. Charlotte's face was etched with concern as she explained what she had discovered. "I've been looking into the documents I found," Charlotte said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's worse than I thought. Mom and Dad are involved in something big, something dangerous." Jonah looked up from his book, his eyes wide with worry. "What do you mean? What are they doing?" Charlotte took a deep breath. "I found information about money laundering and connections to organized crime. They're hiding a lot from us, Jonah. I don't know the whole picture, but it's clear that they're not just running a business." Jonah's expression shifted from confusion to fear. "Are we in danger? What if someone finds out?" Charlotte nodded, her own fear reflected in her eyes. "I don't know, but we have to be careful. We need to figure out what's going on and decide what to do." The weight of their newfound knowledge began to strain Charlotte and Jonah's relationship with their parents. The Byrdes' attempts to maintain normalcy and keep their criminal activities hidden from their children became increasingly difficult. Charlotte and Jonah's growing mistrust and sense of betrayal further fractured the family dynamic. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the tension was palpable. Charlotte and Jonah exchanged uneasy glances, their minds preoccupied with the secrets they had uncovered. Wendy and Marty, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, were increasingly aware of the growing distance between them and their children. During dinner, Jonah broke the silence. "Mom, Dad, why didn't you ever tell us what's really going on? We've seen the papers and heard things. It feels like you're hiding something big from us." Wendy looked up, her face a mask of controlled calm. "We're just trying to protect you. This is a difficult time for all of us, and we're doing what we can to make sure you're safe." Charlotte's voice was firm. "But we're not stupid. We know something's wrong. You can't keep us in the dark forever." Marty's eyes were troubled, and he sighed deeply. "This isn't the right time to discuss this. We're doing everything we can to keep things normal. You need to trust that we know what's best." The tension at home escalated as Charlotte and Jonah's frustration grew. Their trust in their parents was shattered, and their relationship began to deteriorate. Charlotte's efforts to uncover the truth had put her at odds with her parents, while Jonah's fear and confusion made him more withdrawn. The family's interactions became fraught with unspoken conflict and strained conversations. Charlotte and Jonah began to question their parents' decisions and motivations, while Marty and Wendy struggled to manage the fallout of their double lives. One night, as the family gathered in the living room for a rare moment of togetherness, the atmosphere was heavy with unresolved tension. Charlotte spoke up again, her voice breaking the silence. "I don't understand why you've done this," she said, her eyes filled with tears. "Why couldn't you just be honest with us? We're your kids. We deserve to know what's happening." Wendy's face softened with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "We were trying to protect you from the dangers of our world. We didn't want to involve you in something that could hurt you." Jonah looked at his parents with a mix of anger and hurt. "But by hiding everything, you're pushing us away. We're not just kids you can keep in the dark." As Marty and Wendy Byrde struggled to manage their fractured family and keep their criminal enterprise afloat, the cartel's growing impatience began to manifest in a series of increasingly violent threats. The Byrdes' delicate balance of secrecy and deception was put to the ultimate test as they faced a stark warning from their cartel overlords. With their family and their empire at risk, Marty and Wendy were forced to make excruciating decisions to protect what they had built. The tension between the Byrdes and the cartel had been mounting for weeks. Marty and Wendy had been doing their best to keep their operations running smoothly despite the challenges, but the cartel's demands were becoming more aggressive. The cartel's second-in-command, Javi Elizondo, had grown impatient with the slow progress of their money laundering schemes and was pressuring Marty for results. One night, as Marty and Wendy sat in their living room discussing their latest difficulties, a loud knock on the door startled them. Wendy exchanged a worried glance with Marty before walking to answer it. Opening the door, Wendy was confronted by a grim-faced man in a dark suit. He was accompanied by two heavily armed enforcers who stood silently behind him. The man handed Wendy a plain envelope and then turned to leave without a word. Wendy's hands shook as she took the envelope inside and handed it to Marty. He opened it, revealing a series of photographs. The images depicted a scene of violence, a burned-out car with a family resemblance to one of their local associates who had failed to meet the cartel's demands. Marty's face turned pale as he looked at the images. This is a message. The cartel's not playing around anymore. Wendy's voice was tight with fear. What do we do? We can't afford to ignore this. Marty took a deep breath, his mind racing through their options. We need to find a way to placate them. We need to show that we're making progress and that we're still in control. The next day, Marty and Wendy met with Ruth Langmore to discuss the situation. Ruth's involvement in their operations had made her a crucial part of their plans, and her insights were valuable in navigating the cartel's demands. Marty, Wendy, Ruth said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. We need to act fast. The cartel's message is clear. If we don't deliver, we could be next. Marty nodded grimly. We're working on it. We need to ramp up our operations and make sure we're meeting their expectations. Ruth's eyes narrowed with determination. I can help. I've got some contacts who can assist with moving the money faster and getting things back on track. But we need to be smart about it. We can't let them see us panic. Wendy's voice was tinged with desperation. What if they come after us directly? We can't let that happen. We need to make sure our family is safe. Ruth's expression softened slightly. I'll make sure we have security in place. But we need to focus on getting results for the cartel. That's the only way to protect ourselves. Later that night, Marty and Wendy had a tense conversation with their children, Charlotte and Jonah. They had decided that they needed to address the situation head-on and be honest with their kids. Despite their earlier reluctance, Charlotte, Jonah, Wendy began, her voice trembling slightly. We need to talk to you about something serious. There are people who are very angry with us right now, and we're doing everything we can to fix it. Charlotte's eyes widened with fear. What do you mean? Who are these people? Marty's face was filled with resolve. They're people we've been dealing with in our business. They've threatened us, and we're working to make things right. But we need you to understand that we're taking measures to protect ourselves and keep you safe. Jonah's voice was shaky. Are we in danger? What's going to happen to us? Wendy reached out and took Jonah's hand. We're doing everything we can to ensure that you're safe. We've arranged for extra security and are working to resolve the situation. Charlotte looked at her parents, her fear mixing with anger. Why didn't you tell us sooner? We could have helped. Marty shook his head. This isn't something we wanted you involved in. We thought we could handle it without putting you at risk. As the Byrdes scrambled to address the cartel's demands, their efforts to secure their family and protect their empire became increasingly desperate. Marty and Wendy worked around the clock, coordinating with Ruth and their network to expedite their money laundering operations and placate the cartel. One evening, as Marty reviewed financial reports in his office, he received a phone call from Javi Elizondo. The call was brief but threatening. Javi's voice was cold and unyielding. Mr. Byrde, Javi said. You have 1 week to meet our demands. If not, the consequences will be severe. Marty's hands clenched around the phone as he listened. We're working on it. We won't let you down. Javi's response was curt. Make sure you don't. We don't tolerate failure. In the final days leading up to the deadline, the Byrdes and their team worked frantically to ensure they met the cartel's expectations. The pressure was immense, and the stakes were higher than ever. The threat of violence hung over them like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every decision and every move they made. As the Byrdes navigated the escalating threats from the cartel, their situation took a new turn when an FBI agent began investigating Marty's activities. The arrival of law enforcement added another layer of complexity and pressure, forcing Marty and Wendy to intensify their efforts to stay one step ahead. The mounting scrutiny from both the cartel and the FBI pushed the Byrdes to their limits as they fought to protect their family and their illicit empire. Marty's day began with a meeting with Ruth Langmore to discuss their latest money laundering operations. As they reviewed documents and strategized, Marty's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something about it made him uneasy. He answered it, his tone cautious. Hello. Mr. Byrde, a voice on the other end said. This is Agent Olivia Williams with the FBI. I'd like to arrange a meeting with you to discuss some recent developments. Marty's heart sank as he listened to the agent's request. What's this about? Agent Williams's tone was professional but firm. I'm investigating some financial activities linked to your business. I'd like to meet with you to go over a few details. When would be a convenient time? Marty's mind raced. I'm busy today, but I can make time tomorrow. Agent Williams agreed, and they scheduled a meeting for the following day. As Marty hung up, he turned to Ruth, who had been watching him with a concerned expression. Looks like we've got a problem, Marty said, his voice strained. The FBI is on to us. Ruth's eyes widened. That's not good. We need to be careful. They're not going to stop until they get what they want. The next day, Marty prepared for his meeting with Agent Williams. He knew he had to tread carefully, balancing the need to appear cooperative with the necessity of concealing the true nature of his activities. Wendy, equally anxious, reviewed their operations and checked their financial records to ensure everything was in order. When Marty arrived at the FBI office, he was greeted by Agent Olivia Williams, a sharp-eyed investigator with a no-nonsense demeanor. She led him to a conference room where they could talk privately. "Mr. Byrde," Agent Williams began, her tone professional. "Thank you for coming. We're looking into some irregularities in your financial transactions, and I'd like to get your perspective on a few things." Marty nodded, trying to remain calm. "Of course, Agent Williams. I'm happy to help in any way I can." Agent Williams laid out a series of documents and financial statements on the table. "We've noticed some discrepancies and unusual patterns in your accounts. Can you explain these transactions?" Marty glanced at the documents, carefully reviewing the information. "These are just standard business transactions. We've been working with a variety of clients and partners. Sometimes things may look unusual, but they're all legitimate." Agent Williams scrutinized him closely. "I understand, but we need to ensure everything is above board. Any information you can provide would be helpful." Meanwhile, back at the Byrdes' home, Wendy was dealing with the fallout of the FBI investigation. The pressure was mounting, and she could see the strain it was putting on their family. Charlotte and Jonah were becoming increasingly aware of the tensions and the secrets being kept from them. One evening, as Wendy sat with Charlotte and Jonah, she decided to have a frank discussion with them. The family needed to address the growing strain and the reality of their situation. "Charlotte, Jonah," Wendy began, her voice heavy with emotion. "I know things have been difficult, and we've been keeping a lot from you. The FBI is investigating us, and it's creating a lot of pressure." Charlotte's eyes widened with concern. "What are they looking for? Are we in trouble?" Wendy's face was filled with worry. "They're investigating our business, but we're doing everything we can to cooperate. We want to protect you and make sure you're safe." Jonah, still feeling uneasy, asked, "What if they find out something? What will happen to us?" Wendy's voice trembled. "We're doing everything we can to keep things under control. We're working with our legal team and making sure we comply with all regulations." The FBI's investigation added another layer of urgency to the Byrdes' efforts to manage their criminal operations. Marty and Wendy knew they had to stay vigilant, balancing their interactions with law enforcement while continuing to placate the cartel. Marty met with Ruth to strategize their next steps. "We need to make sure we're covering all our bases. The FBI is scrutinizing everything we do. We need to be extra cautious." Ruth nodded, her expression serious. "I've been working on tightening up our operations and making sure everything looks clean. We'll need to stay one step ahead and avoid any mistakes." The pressure from both the cartel and the FBI created a tense environment where every move was critical. Marty and Wendy were forced to navigate a dangerous minefield of legal and criminal threats, all while trying to protect their family. As the FBI's investigation intensified and the cartel's demands became more pressing, Marty and Wendy Byrde found themselves in a precarious position. Their struggle to secure their future drove them to make bold and risky moves, each with the potential to either save or destroy their family. The stakes had never been higher as they fought to navigate the treacherous waters of law enforcement scrutiny and cartel threats. The Byrdes' home was a hive of activity as Marty and Wendy scrambled to address the mounting pressures. In their makeshift command center, the basement office, they reviewed documents, made phone calls, and strategized their next steps. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety and urgency. "We're running out of time," Wendy said, her voice tense as she examined a stack of financial reports. "The FBI is closing in, and the cartel's patience is wearing thin. We need to act quickly." Marty, pacing back and forth, nodded in agreement. "We need to find a way to satisfy both sides. If we can't keep the cartel happy and stay ahead of the FBI, we're done for." Wendy's eyes were sharp with determination. "We need to increase the volume of our operations to show progress to the cartel. At the same time, we have to create a more convincing cover for the FBI. We can't let them see any cracks in our facade." Their desperation led them to consider increasingly audacious moves. Marty arranged a meeting with Javi Elizondo to discuss their progress and address the cartel's concerns. The meeting was held in a secluded warehouse, where Marty and Javi faced each other across a large table cluttered with documents and financial records. Javi's demeanor was cold and unforgiving. "Mr. Byrde, you've had ample time to meet our expectations. What assurances can you give us that you're making the necessary progress?" Marty's voice was steady but filled with underlying tension. "We're ramping up our operations and diversifying our investments. We're also expanding our network to handle the increased volume. You'll see results soon." Javi's eyes narrowed. "You better be right. We're not in the mood for excuses. If we don't see significant progress within the next week, we will take matters into our own hands." Marty's heart raced, but he maintained a calm exterior. "Understood. We'll deliver." Simultaneously, Wendy met with her legal team to address the FBI's investigation. They needed to strengthen their defense and ensure that their financial records appeared flawless. Wendy was in a conference room with her attorney, discussing strategies to handle the scrutiny. "We need to ensure that every transaction looks legitimate," her attorney advised. "We should prepare for a possible audit and be ready with detailed explanations for any discrepancies." Wendy's expression was grim. "We're doing everything we can to cooperate, but the pressure from the cartel is also immense. We need to find a way to keep the FBI at bay while still satisfying the cartel's demands." Her attorney nodded. "We'll need to stay on top of our game. Any slip-up could be catastrophic." Back at home, Charlotte and Jonah were increasingly aware of the chaos enveloping their family. The atmosphere was fraught with tension, and they could sense the danger looming over them. Charlotte, in particular, was becoming more involved in trying to understand their situation and help where she could. "Mom, Dad," Charlotte said one evening, her voice firm. "We need to know what's going on. We can't keep living like this, with secrets and lies. If there's something we can do to help, we want to be involved." Wendy looked at her daughter, torn between protecting her and involving her in their dangerous world. "It's not safe for you to be involved in this. We're trying to shield you from the worst of it." Charlotte's face was resolute. "But if we're in danger, we need to know." We can't just sit here and wait." Wendy's expression softened with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "We're doing everything we can to keep you safe. Just trust that we're handling it." The tension escalated as Marty and Wendy took their bold steps. They coordinated with Ruth Langmore to accelerate their laundering operations, pushing their network to its limits. The increased activity created a frenzy of transactions and investments, all aimed at satisfying the cartel's demands. At the same time, Wendy and her legal team crafted an elaborate cover story to present to the FBI. They prepared meticulously for the possibility of a more thorough investigation and developed strategies to deflect suspicion. The Byrdes' efforts to juggle the demands of both the cartel and the FBI left them on edge. Each move they made carried significant risk, and the consequences of failure were dire. Their strategy involved high stakes and bold maneuvers, with the potential for either a breakthrough or a catastrophic downfall. As the Byrde situation reached a boiling point, they faced a critical decision that would determine their future: stay and fight against the cartel and the FBI, or flee and abandon everything they had built. With tensions reaching a breaking point, their loyalty to each other and their commitment to their dangerous lifestyle were tested like never before. The pressure on the Byrde family had become unbearable. Marty and Wendy were overwhelmed by the dual threat of the cartel's violence and the FBI's scrutiny. Each day brought new challenges, and the risks of staying in their current situation were mounting. Desperation drove them to consider the most drastic option available: escape. In their basement office, the Byrdes convened a family meeting to discuss their dire situation. The atmosphere was thick with apprehension as they gathered around the table, their faces etched with worry. "We've reached a point where we need to make a decision," Marty began, his voice heavy. "We can't continue managing the cartel's demands and the FBI's investigation indefinitely. We need to decide whether to stay and fight or to make a plan to escape." Wendy's eyes were filled with fear and resolve. "If we stay, we risk everything. The cartel is getting more aggressive, and the FBI is closing in. But if we leave, we have to abandon everything we've worked for. It's a tough choice." Charlotte's voice was tense. "What's our plan if we decide to escape? How do we even start over after all of this?" Marty looked at his children, understanding their concerns. "We'd need to leave behind everything we know. It means finding a new place to live, cutting ties with our current life, and ensuring that we stay off the radar. It's a huge risk, but it might be our only option." While the family discussed their options, Ruth Langmore was busy working on a backup plan. She knew the Byrde situation was critical and had been discreetly preparing for the possibility of their escape. Ruth met with Marty in a secluded location to discuss their escape plan. "I've been looking into possible safe houses and routes for you," Ruth said, her voice low. "We need to act quickly if we're going to pull this off. The cartel won't wait forever, and the FBI's investigation is getting closer." Marty nodded, his face tense. "We need to ensure that everything is in place before we make a final decision. If we decide to go, we have to be ready to move quickly and quietly." Ruth handed Marty a folder containing information about potential locations and escape routes. "I've arranged a few options. We'll need to coordinate logistics and make sure we have everything we need to disappear without a trace. Back at home, tensions between Charlotte and Jonah intensified as the family's decision-making process dragged on. Charlotte, who had been deeply involved in understanding the situation, was torn between loyalty to her family and her desire for a stable life. "We can't keep living like this," Charlotte said to Jonah one evening. "If we stay, we're risking our lives. But if we leave, we're leaving everything behind. What do you think we should do?" Jonah, his face reflecting the uncertainty of their situation, replied, "I don't know. It feels like we're caught between two impossible choices. But I trust Mom and Dad to do what's best for us." Charlotte's voice was filled with frustration. "I just wish we had a clear answer. It's hard to see the right path when everything is so chaotic." The Byrdes' decision to escape was not taken lightly. They weighed the risks and consequences, considering the impact on their family and their future. The logistical challenges of relocating and starting over were daunting, but the increasing danger made it a viable option. Marty and Wendy decided to move forward with the escape plan, preparing to leave behind their current life. They began the process of selling off assets, arranging for their immediate departure, and ensuring that their escape routes were secure. As the final preparations were underway, the family faced their last moments in their old life. The sense of impending change and the weight of their decision created a heavy atmosphere. Each member of the Byrde family was forced to confront the reality of leaving behind their home and the life they had known. In their final conversation, Wendy spoke to Charlotte and Jonah, her voice filled with determination and sadness. "We're doing this to keep our family safe. I know it's hard to leave everything behind, but we need to focus on protecting ourselves and starting fresh." Charlotte, her eyes filled with tears, nodded. "I understand. It's just so hard to let go." Jonah, trying to stay strong, added, "We'll get through this. We have each other, and that's what matters."